The desert wind howled through the canyon, carrying the scent of dust and gunpowder. The sun, a cruel overseer in the sky, beat down on the dry earth, casting long shadows that stretched like reaching fingers. The land was vast, wild, and dangerous, just the way outlaws liked it. A gang of rough-looking men rode hard, their horses kicking up clouds of dirt as they thundered across the open plain. Their faces were covered in dust, their eyes sharp with the hunger of men who lived by taking what they wanted. At the center of their group, tied to the back of a horse, was a woman, her wrists bound, her dark curls tangled from the wind. But her eyes, fierce and unwavering, told a different story. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't begging. She was waiting. The leader of the gang, a grizzled man with a scar running down his cheek, glanced back at their captive and spat to the side. "I don't know why the boss wants her, but I hope he knows she ain't some weak town girl," he muttered. Another outlaw, younger and jittery, laughed nervously. "Reckon he just wants leverage. Folks in town seem mighty protective of her." The woman didn't speak. She just watched, listened. Her mind worked fast, memorizing the route, the number of men, the way they held their guns. She'd been in trouble before, and she knew trouble didn't last forever. What these men didn't know, what they couldn't even begin to imagine, was that someone was already coming for them. And he wasn't just any man. He was a legend whispered in saloons and around campfires. A name that sent shivers down the spines of outlaws from here to the Rio Grande. The most feared gunslinger in the West. And these men had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. The sun dipped lower in the sky, setting the desert ablaze in hues of orange and gold. The outlaws rode fast, their horses breathing heavy, the woman still tied at the center of their formation. They moved like men who had done this before, snatching, running, and hiding. But this time, they had taken the wrong person. As the woman bounced in her saddle, her wrists raw from the rope, she kept her breathing steady. Panic had no place here. She wasn't the type to scream or plead. That wasn't who she was. She had seen enough in her life to know that fear wouldn't save her. Only patience. Only action at the right moment. The leader, the one they called Clay Barker, glanced over at her again. His face was rough, worn by too many days in the sun, too many nights of drinking and running from the law. He was the kind of man who didn't mind getting his hands dirty. But something about the woman's silence unsettled him. "Most folks be beggin' by now," he muttered. The woman lifted her chin, meeting his gaze without a hint of fear. "Most folks ain't me." The gang let out nervous chuckles, but Clay only scowled. He didn't like it. He didn't like the way she held herself, like she wasn't the one tied up, like she had already figured a way out. They rode deeper into the canyons, where the rock walls rose high on either side. The air growing thick and still. The sun barely reached the ground here, and a strange quiet settled over the land. The only sounds were the horses' hooves and the occasional distant cry of a hawk. Then something changed. A feeling. A shift in the air. Clay slowed his horse, raising a hand to signal the others to stop. He listened. The desert had a way of telling you when something wasn't right, and right now, it was screaming. "Something wrong?" one of his men asked. Clay didn't answer. He just listened. The wind had stopped. The usual hum of the desert, the insects, the rustling of distant animals, had vanished. It was too quiet. Then, a shot rang out, sharp, precise, echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. One of the outlaws dropped from his saddle before he even knew what hit him. Panic erupted. The men scrambled, reaching for their guns, looking in every direction. But there was no one there. Then another shot. Another man fell. "Where is he?" one of them yelled, spitting wildly. The woman knew. She had known from the moment the silence took hold. He was here. The most feared gunslinger. The one they whispered about in hushed voices. The one they never wanted to cross. And he wasn't coming to negotiate. Clay's heart pounded as he tried to get a grip on the chaos. They were being hunted. Picked off one by one. He had been in gunfights before. But this was something different. This was precise. This was personal. He turned sharply to the woman, realization dawning on his face. "You." But before he could finish, another shot cracked through the canyon. And this time, it was meant for him. He barely dodged in time, the bullet grazing his arm. He yanked his horse around, rage and desperation flashing in his eyes. "Ride, get to cover," he barked. The outlaws scattered, their formation broken, fear gripping them tight. The woman smiled for the first time that day, because she knew how this ended. And it wasn't with the outlaws riding away free. It was with them learning the hard way why some legends weren't just stories. Dust swirled through the canyon as the outlaws scrambled for cover, their horses rearing up in fear. Panic had set in. They had started this ride as men with control, thinking they were the ones in charge. But now, they were prey, hunted by a ghost with a gun. Clay Barker ducked behind a jagged rock, clutching his bleeding arm. His breath came fast, uneven. He had faced lawmen, bounty hunters, even rival gangs. But this was something else. This wasn't just a shootout. It was an execution, one bullet at a time, and he knew exactly who was behind it. The woman was still tied, still sitting on the horse, but she wasn't afraid. That unsettled Clay more than the gunfire. "Call him off," he growled at her, eyes sharp with desperation. "You got pull with him, don't you?" She tilted her head, considering him like he was a child asking for something he didn't deserve. Then she simply said, "No one calls him off." Clay cursed under his breath. Another shot rang out. Another one of his men hit the ground. The others fired wildly into the canyon, hoping to hit something, anything, but there was no clear target, just shadows, echoes, death waiting in the silence. Then the footsteps started, slow, steady, the kind that didn't need to rush, the kind that told everyone listening that time was already up. A lone figure stepped from the shadows. Dressed in worn leather, dust coating his boots, his hat pulled low, a gun in one hand, still smoking. His face was unreadable, carved by years of hard living, but his eyes were what made men fear him. Cold, precise, filled with something deeper than anger. Something final. Clay's throat went dry. "You should left her alone," the gunslinger said, his voice calm, like this was just another day. Clay gritted his teeth. "It's just business," he shot back. The gunslinger shook his head. "Not today." Clay moved first. His hand darted for his gun, but he was too slow. The gunslinger fired once, the shot cracking through the canyon like lightning. Clay's gun clattered to the ground, his fingers slick with blood. He staggered back, pain searing through his hand. The rest of the outlaws hesitated, their will to fight slipping away. One by one, they dropped their weapons, hands raised. They had seen enough. The gunslinger took a slow step forward, closing the distance between himself and Clay. "You took something that wasn't yours," he said, his voice like the wind before a storm. "Now you get to live with that mistake." Clay's face twisted in fury, but he knew it was over. He knew the only reason he was still breathing was because the gunslinger had allowed it. The woman sat quietly, watching it all unfold. When the gunslinger turned to her, his gaze softened, just enough for her to notice. Without a word, he pulled his knife, cut the ropes binding her wrists, and offered her his hand. She took it without hesitation. She rubbed her sore wrists, looking at him with a knowing expression. "Took you long enough." He smirked, just barely. "Had to make an entrance." She nodded, stepping down from the horse. Behind them, the remaining outlaws stood frozen, waiting, unsure if they would be allowed to walk away. The gunslinger gave them a final glance. "Run," he said simply. They didn't need to be told twice. They mounted their horses and disappeared into the desert, carrying the weight of their failure. The woman watched them go before turning back to the gunslinger. "You gonna chase him down?" He shook his head. "They'll spend the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders. That's punishment enough." She studied him for a long moment. "You always this dramatic?" He gave a small chuckle. "Only when it matters." She smiled. It wasn't often she smiled, but this time it felt right. Then without another word, they walked side by side toward the fading sun, the desert stretching out before them. A silent understanding passed between them. Some names were whispered in fear, some in respect. His name was both. And for those foolish enough to cross him, it was the last name they ever heard. The legend of the most feared gunslinger would live on. But tonight, it was just another sunset. Another ride. Another day where the right kind of justice had found its way back to the West.